Hello and welcome. My name is Eric Elliott. I'm the Estate Director for Heitz here in Napa Valley. And we're joined by Brittany Sherwood, our Director of Winemaking. We're so excited to be with you today and to talk about some of the history of this property, the legacy, and then also the future, and share some really special wines with you. This is a really important year for us to celebrate 60 years as the 12th winery ever established after Prohibition. It's something that we're both very proud of and honored to talk about today. I think that history and legacy is something that's so important, especially in the Napa Valley. And as we have gone through so many iterations of changes in this valley, for us to have really stayed true to our identity is something that we hold dear. I want to talk a little bit about the history of Heitz. So the property, or the estate, was really founded in 1961, but the story begins a little before that. So Joe Heitz, our founding kind of patriarch, was born in Princeton, Illinois in the early 1900s and ended up being in the Air Force for World War II and was stationed in Fresno. And during that time, he really fell in love with winemaking and decided to pursue a little bit more of the educational side. So in 1948, he graduated with a degree in enology and viticulture from UC Davis. He was only one of 7 people to hold that title at the time. And then he ventures up to the Napa Valley and apprentices under one of the most iconic men really in the history of winemaking, especially in the New World, and that was Andrei Chelychev at Bellevue Vineyards. And Joe was there for almost a decade, from 1951 to 1959. And he was really tapped to become really the next winemaker after Chelychev retired. And Joe had this incredible desire to really create something for himself, and I think that he was compelled. You know, Andre wasn't going to leave the winery for probably another 20 or 30 years, so Joe decides to go back down to Fresno. He founds the education and enology program at Fresno State, and then ventures back up to the Napa Valley in 1961, purchases 8 acres on Highway 29 and founds Heitz. And that was a really kind of pivotal time. You know, there wasn't a lot of land acquisition going on then. Joe did a lot of pioneering things. I think, you know, for us, and we'll talk a little bit more about the history of Martha's Vineyard, but that decision to make the first ever single vineyard wine in the Napa Valley is something that really ushered in a new movement and a focus on terroir and site specificity, and something that I think is underestimated sometimes in terms of the importance of that decision. After that, Joe did a number of other things, obviously acquiring really iconic parcels throughout the Napa Valley, like the Trailside Vineyard and the Linda Falls Vineyard. And then for those of you that have been drinking Heitz for decades, we also had access to the Bella Oaks Vineyard from 1976 to 2007, and then a few vintages in the 70s of the Fay Vineyard, this iconic parcel in Stag's Leap District. And I think for us, the cornerstone has always been about making really elegant, balanced wines that can stand the test of time, but also farming. Do you want to touch on farming a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
So, like Eric was saying, the cornerstone of Heitz has always been sustainable farming with an emphasis in organic farming. Joe was really a pioneer in that endeavor, and we have been working with the same vineyard management company since our inception. And they have really, you know, taken the reins on our farming protocol and have been working with us, you know, day in, day out for decades, really trying to understand how our vineyards respond to different farming practices. And we have found that the best way to do things is through a sustainable hand. We've recently transitioned to biodynamic farming, which is an even more holistic approach to organic farming, really working with Mother Nature in terms of plants, animals, insects, to really bring a more holistic and ecological approach to viticulture. Everything that we do is all about the health of the vineyards and the health of the vines, and we have found that the healthier our vineyards are and the healthier the surrounding ecosystem is, the better and higher quality fruit that we receive is. And with that, I want to jump into some of our winemaking practices.
Of course.
And just sort of touch on what makes vinification at Heitz so special. So Eric mentioned our farming and how tied that is to high quality winemaking. For us, we really want to make sure that we are picking our fruit at the exact right decision to make sure that we have complex aromatics, to make sure that our tannin structure is perfectly in balance with sugar ripening. And this takes a lot of work in the vineyards to achieve. You know, numbers are one thing, taste is everything, but if you want to put a number on things, we always try to aim to pick before 24 bricks, so that way our alcohols are naturally in balance. All of our fermentation at Heitz takes place in stainless steel tanks. And after that, our wines are able to age in large oak foudre for about 9 months before it's barreled down into 228-liter French oak barrels. We exclusively use French oak here at Heitz Cellar. It's a preference in terms of flavor profile, and we really think that the wines age beautifully in those vessels. After barrel aging for an extended period of time, really depending on the program, and we'll get into that as we talk about each wine, the wines are then blended and bottled and allowed to age for a minimum of 12 months before being released.
Which is really rare, you know, it lends
Very
us
rare.
to having one of the longest aging programs in the entire Napa Valley. And I think, you know, Brittany and I are so fortunate to have inherited an estate that appreciates patience and intention and thoughtfulness in terms of not just how the wine is made, but how the wine ages and develops, and ultimately how it's transferred to the guests. You know, it's an age-old question: how do you make a wine that's really delicious in its youth and then also has the ability to stand the test of time? And so many of these vinification techniques and philosophies were really instilled by Joe Heitz, and they've largely remained unchanged for the last 60 years.
That's right.
To me, one of the most exciting things that we have is that patience and that longevity, and I think it's become a hallmark. And if you think about the greatest wine regions in the world, the ones that really dictated what quality wine is, obviously a lot of those are from Europe. So you think about Barolo, Barbaresco, you know, Brunello di Montalcino, Ribera del Duero, Rioja, all of those have really long minimum aging periods because it mandates an integration and a harmony and a cohesiveness that you achieve in wine when you allow that patience. It's something that Joe recognized early on, but it's a big challenge financially, honestly, and it's part of the reason very few states decide to take on that endeavor. But it's something that we're proud of, especially as we talk about these wines today, you know, the 13 and 14 vintage. Very few producers are still on those releases, and I think it's a testament for us to really just have that kind of wherewithal and that intention behind when wines are ready to be released.
Absolutely. So with that, I would love to jump into the wines that we are tasting with you, starting with the 2013 Trailside Vineyard. So Trailside is located on the eastern side of Napa Valley in Rutherford at the base of the Vaca Mountains. And is a really, really unique site just in terms of geological profile that's at that vineyard. The different soil structures we have, the different soil types, really lends itself to being a very diverse vineyard in terms of flavor profile, tannin structure, and just all the different subtle nuances that we're able to coax from the Trailside Vineyard. And with it, it lends itself to being a beautifully complex Cabernet Sauvignon. All of our wines are actually 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, and I think that that's something that really allows us to speak to the testament of the terroir.
And it was another thing that was really something Joe instilled. He believed that the purest expression of a vineyard can only come from a single varietal. Okay. So the wines have always been about purity and refinement. I think historically there's such a significance to the Trailside Vineyard as well. If you look at some of the iconic bottlings that helped shape Rutherford and really put them on the map as one of the most premier appellations, not just in the Napa Valley, but in the world for Cabernet Sauvignon. A lot of the fruit from those wines was coming from the Trailside Vineyard. So if you drink Old Souverain, Old Spring Mountain, you know, even some bottlings from BV were sourcing from there. And, you know, it makes sense that Joe would have had such an understanding of that terroir, having spent so much time at BV, which was largely focused on Rutherford at the time. So that when the opportunity in 1984 came for Joe to purchase that and acquire that iconic parcel, he jumped on it. First vintage was 1989, and basically Brittany touched on where it's located, but you know, a lot of the soils, these volcanic soils, came down the Vaca mountain range, so you have more structure, more intensity from an expression of Cabernet, and then you also have an abundance of clay and silt and more heavy alluvial sediments as you get closer to the concrete. So while the vineyard may appear large on a map, it's about 85 acres, less than 10 acres actually go into the single vineyard bottle. And it's a wine that to me has always been so representative, not just of the terroir of Rutherford, but of that site. So you have these really beautiful soft red fruits. You have this herbal characteristic that's so complementary with fine cuisine, things like charcuterie. It always has this presence of savory herbs as well too. So you think about sage and rosemary, bay laurel and thyme. So moving on to 2013 Martha's Vineyard, obviously a wine that, you know, incredibly collectible, but the site to me is so unique. We know the history, we know the lore, you know, it being the first ever single vineyard wine released from the Napa Valley. Again, 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, and also a wine that was represented the United States in the Judgment of Paris. 1970 vintage of Martha's was in the 76 Judgment of Paris. But the site is really miraculous. If you have an opportunity to go there, I think you notice it right away. So it lies in the western foothills of Oakville in the shadows of the Mayacamas Mountains. And it has this beautiful aspect and elevation that really lend itself towards the benchlands that really made both Oakville and Rutherford very famous. So it has just enough drainage where it can kind of maintain some of that water table. You know, we get very little rain in the Napa Valley. Almost all the rain comes, if it does come, in spring. And it forces the grapevines to dig very deep in search of nutrients in the water table. And as a result, you tend to get more concentration, more depth, more levity in the wines. But you also have this incredibly long growing season. And that's partly because of the aspect and because it is protected from that late afternoon sun. To me, this wine is always outstanding, but you remember the 13 vintage pretty well. Do you want to touch on, obviously, that for Martha's, but also just the history of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 2013 vintage for Martha's Vineyard, also exceptional. We saw some really great concentration. And for me, the 2013 really highlights some distinct mint characteristics for Martha's Vineyard, something that we love and that we really want to showcase. But the 2013 in particular, I think that we're really seeing those highlighted notes from Martha's Vineyard.
And that location that we had kind of referenced, so if you're standing at Martha's Vineyard and you're looking west, you're looking up the Mayacamas Mountains, you know, as you get into kind of the other side of Sonoma, and the border is really Harlan Estate. And then just to the east is the Tokelon Vineyard, specifically Opus 1's portion. And then the eucalyptus trees run north to south, and they separate Martha's Vineyard from Tokelon. So they're still very much there. If you go there, they seem to go on forever. It's like they reach up and touch the sky. It's really a unique experience to have the opportunity to visit that site. And to me, this wine is one that undoubtedly will last another 50 or 60 years, but something we're very, very proud of right now as well.
Absolutely. So with that, I think that we're going to move on to the 2014 vintage, talking about two of our single vineyard designate wines. The first one in your flight is 2014 Linda Falls, and this is a relatively new single vineyard designate wine for us. So Linda Falls is one of our vineyards up on Howell Mountain, which is a really unique aspect to a vineyard from Howell Mountain too. It's more southeast facing, which means that it's capturing more of that gentle morning sunlight compared to being west facing, which a lot of the vineyards on Howell Mountain are, and that capture a lot more afternoon sunlight. And so for Linda Falls to be east facing and getting that gentle morning sunlight, it also is in a bowl shape on Howell Mountain that allows it to capture and retain more of that morning fog. And so for Linda Falls, we have a much longer growing period on Howell Mountain. This really allows us to have softer tannins, really develop the wine from a phenological perspective, and really get just these soft, beautiful, but still rustic Howell Mountain tannins, something that's really, really special. The Heitz family purchased Linda Falls in 2002, and we actually didn't start making this wine until 2013. So this that you're tasting, the 2014 Linda Falls, is only the second release of this wine. So for us, releasing a new single vineyard designate is something that's really special to us. It took us a really long time to work with this fruit and really figure out what can we do for Linda Falls to do Linda Falls justice and really give the best representation of this vineyard.
And it's the smallest vineyard that we farm, unquestionably. I think Brittany touched on it, about 7.5 acres. Obviously the lowest production as well too, but there's an incredible story. So when the Heitz family purchased it in 2002, they purchased 35 acres high up on Howell Mountain at about 1,500 feet elevation, and they actually donated 28 back to the land trust.
That's right.
It's a really unique type of fauna and just kind of microclimate and environment up there. There's a specific type of Douglas fir trees, there's juniper bushes, there are just these elements that are really brought into the wine. I always get this beautiful pine characteristic from it. We talk about herbs and their expression kind of through Cabernet Sauvignon as a vessel in a lot of the wines from Heitz Cellar. And I think to me, that's always a result of picking at the absolute opportune moment.
Absolutely.
We know that pyrazines can have a green character in Cabernet, and then overripe Cabernet can obviously kind of wash a lot of that out. And I've always thought the greatest producers of this varietal always get the pick absolutely right. And then for us, I think it's always, and Brittany can touch on this, it's about less is more from a stewardship in the winery. It's really about showcasing the characteristics of the site, and Linda has a slightly different aging regimen than Martha's and Trailside, is that right?
Absolutely. So Martha's and Trailside will both spend about 36 months in French oak barrels, whereas Linda Falls spend 2 full years in French oak barrels, but then an additional year in bottle. And it's really that bottle aging, 2 years for Linda Falls, that helps to soften, coax, and really just bring everything back into harmony and full integration for Linda Falls.
I love the 14s too. I think to me, there's such an indication of softness and approachability right now, and where 13 is a wine that you would lay down and that you know will age, your grandkids will be able to drink these vintages. I think 14 has longevity, but it's certainly one that's more giving, more opulent, more fresh as it stands today. Should we touch on 14 Martha's?
Yeah, absolutely. So we already talked a lot about Martha's Vineyard from a vineyard perspective. And so I think just going back and the fact that you've already tasted the 2013, this is a really wonderful opportunity to be able to taste 2 vintages of Martha's side by side and really understand and see that vintage difference, something that's pretty rare. So for us, again, we were just talking about the 2014 just as being a little bit softer, more opulent vintage. It's a little bit more easy to drink right now, but we know this can go the distance. I think that Martha's Vineyard right now is showing just some beautiful black fruit characteristics on the 2014, a little bit of that minty characteristic that we know and love. And again, the tannin structure on this wine is just so soft and elegant. We're really, really proud of the 2014 vintage.
I always think it's a testament as well to Joe and the vinification that you practice, where it's always about the expression of the site, but it's also about the expression of a vintage. It would be relatively easy to make a consistent style of wine regardless of vintage. You see a lot of producers do it in Napa, but to have that pure vintage expression, coupled with the expression of site and the monovarietal of Cabernet, I think is seldom seen. And it's something to me that I think is so distinguishable between the 13 and the 14, and something I love. I think it'll be interesting to taste them in another 20 or 30 years.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. And with that, we are so thankful again to be able to spend today with you and just doing a great training on our 13 Trailside, 13 Martha's Vineyard, 14 Linda Falls, and 14 Martha's Vineyard. We look forward to tasting with you guys again soon. So thank you.
And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you ever find yourself in the Napa Valley. We're really fortunate to have this incredible property in the eastern foothills of St. Helena, and then another tasting salon on Highway 29, the original site of the purchase that Joe made in 1961.
That's right.
So cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.